Hello Internet, and welcome back to Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. And yeah, no preamble this week, let's just get into it here. So first up today from Kasan Ryukin, we've got frog legs. Now currently these are harvested only from bullfrogs, which are the small, unmutated version of frogs that we've got in the game. They can also be purchased from the Hunter NPC, which I'm not super familiar with, and the recipes that were added to cook them were cooked, smoked, dried, rehydrated, and fried frog legs. Now the PR does mention some issues with butchering these creatures, however. See, bullfrogs only have 4 HP, which means if you hit them with any of a large number of weapons that you will most likely overkill those creatures. Basically, this is a product of a high damage weapon killing something that has a much lower HP, and when this happens, a creature's corpse instantly becomes pulped, which makes it more difficult to harvest from them, which causes lower yields in terms of meat and things like that. So as a result, you probably won't get any frog legs from a pulped bullfrog, so you're going to have to attack these with something with a relatively low damage. Now the creator expressed an interest in adding larger frog legs to the larger, more mutated frogs in the future, but as of now they're limited to bullfrogs. So yeah, you can now harvest and cook and eat frog legs, so congratulations. Now I've never had them in real life that I can remember. I seem to recall people saying it's basically like eating a chicken wing, so there you go. Next up today from Flying Space Rhino, we've got the addition of a unicorn plush toy. Now in the last episode we talked about Angelo adding a variety of plushes. I pointed out that we still didn't have a unicorn plush, which, now when I pointed that out, it was mostly a joke. It was really just an excuse to reference Angelo because they've been doing a lot of variants recently and I wanted to shout them out. Well, now Flying Space Rhino took it upon themselves to rectify this and add a proper unicorn plush to the game. They added 2 plushes, however, and I feel kind of bad pointing this out, one of the ones they added is a direct reference to me. And while it's extremely flattering to think that I could be permanently included in some small way in the Cataclysm history of the game and be involved in the game, we do have a rule, unfortunately, about not adding references to community members. Now if this were someone else being referenced, I would point out that rule, so it would be pretty hypocritical of me not to mention it here. I did point it out on Discord, but the general response was basically just people shrugging and being like, who cares, it doesn't really matter. I just, for transparency and all that jazz, I did want to say something. So like I said, extremely flattering. It's very nice of you to add that. I just felt very obligated to I don't know, I had to say something about it. Moving on, next up today from Venera, we've got a prosthetics mod that removes a lot of the recent limb features and places them in a separate mod. Now although I didn't see any reference in the PR to the stable version, I'm pretty sure that was done because of the upcoming stable release. Well, and because a lot of these features are they're works in progress. They're not fully fleshed out yet. Now the basic idea is to take all the prosthetics, the gastropod foot mutation, things like that, and slot them into a separate mod. This way the majority of players are not exposed to them while the features are a bit buggy, and properly, we can communicate to them that, hey, this is a work in progress. And of course that means because it's a mod, it can be easily disabled in case someone finds that very frustrating. Now the mod can easily be enabled if you want to do that. It's called Work in Progress Limb Stuff, which is currently located at the very bottom of my mod list and appears to have no category. And just ignore my prolific and completely outdated list of mods in the screenshot here. So to be clear, no content was actually removed from the game. It was simply stuffed over to this mod while they work on those things. Now how is this going to affect my game? I already have prosthetics or limb mutations or etc. I hear your question, Internet, and my answer is I have no idea. Now I thought these would simply be obsoleted, meaning they would no longer, they would remain in your game and in your playthrough, but not appear in future areas or as possible mutations. However, in the obsolescence file here, there's actually a big list of migrations. And to my understanding, migrations will take an item and turn it into something else when the game loads. So in this file, for example, the right arm prosthetic gets turned into to a plank when you would load up the game. So I actually have no idea how that works. I could be wrong about that. I don't know much about migrations and obsoletions. Maybe one of you contributors can leave a comment down below to clarify for people who are interested. And I am sorry that I don't know more about it, so I'm a bit confused. I think your prosthetics are going to just appear to be planks when you load up the game. I find that pretty strange. You know, I don't know. If you want it, you can easily enable the mod, as I said, but yeah, it might be a little wonky in an existing save. But anyway, moving on, next up today from Carol, we've got some giant fish shenanigans. Now it looks like our giant salmon was tweaked, which is a creature I didn't even know we had, and it looks like it was knocked down from being what was referred to as Jaws-like in the PR. They also mention it could previously smell you, which I find infinitely amusing for a fish. And to compensate for this nerf, or maybe because Carol loves fish, 2 other creatures were added to the game. These were the huge salmon, which is larger, and a leaper salmon, which is larger than larger. The leaper salmon also, you know, leaps at you, including when you're on land, which I find very interesting. Now we don't have any infrastructure that kills water creatures when they leave the water, so this thing can hop around and follow you. Now, I actually mentioned this to Carol on Discord because I happened to see them and they said the range is actually 10 tiles for this leap. However, the cooldown is 30, and it's a pretty noticeable cooldown. You really shouldn't have any issues getting away from this thing if that's what you want to do. I just do find it amusing that it hops after you even when you're on land. Now, unfortunately, I do have a small issue here with their butchery results. When you butcher a normal fish, you receive fish fillets, which are separate from our normal meat. Now, fish meat is distinct from, say, a cow's meat in terms of calorie density and the materials you would gain from harvest, things like that. However, these large mutant fish butcher for mutant meat because we have no mutant fish meat. Now, I'm not actually sure if this matters to anyone or how much it would actually impact the game, but, you know, if someone wanted to add mutant fish meat, maybe that's a thing we want. I actually don't know. It really doesn't hurt to abstract it the way it is to just mutant meat, but, you know, I don't know. I thought it was something I would mention. I thought it was interesting. Anyway, back to the PR. There were miscellaneous other changes to fish here, addressing their roe and fries, but mostly you're probably not interested in that. You probably only care about the big old mutant fish. And then finally, as I was scrolling here, I see Carol said that the upgraded versions don't actually spawn anywhere in the game, so these should just be purely upgrade over time creatures. So it's very unlikely that you're going to see these in the early game. Looks like they're just, you know, upgrade over time. Next up today from Karam Baba G, we've got some infrastructure for profession and background conditions. So what does that actually mean? Well, basically it allows NPCs to respond differently to you based on your character's background or profession. For example, in the PR, they suggest that if you were a priest, you could have one of your NPCs request that you take their confession. Or if you're an EMT and met a similar EMT character in the game, you might have some special dialogue since you both were medical professionals during the crazy days before the game starts. Now currently, this PR doesn't actually add any of those things, not that I saw, but it enabled it so that those things can exist in the future. I think this is very cool. There are very few interactions like this in the game. I believe there is one faction that is set up to hate you if you're wearing the deputy badge or whatever, but none of those were tied to your actual profession or your background. So yeah, I know like it's nothing from the player facing side yet, but definitely wanted to let the contributors watching know that you can do this now. I think this is very cool. Next up today, also from Karam Baba G, we've got a tweak to the guilt the player feels after defeating zombie children. So most of you are familiar with this guilt. You put one of them down and your player feels bad. After you've defeated 100 of them, you no longer feel guilty. However, if you then went and fought some of the other versions of zombie children, like the Howling Waif, you would again feel guilty. So apparently the way this worked previously is that it was tracked per enemy, which is pretty ridiculous. Asking you to kill 100 of each individual enemy is just pretty out there. And if I'm understanding it right, guilt should now track that count regardless of which zombie child variant you actually defeat. Now I think this makes a lot of sense. This seems like a good change, you know, if you're fighting a zombie child versus a snot gobbler or whatever the other names for these creatures are. They're all zombie children. It would be lumped together. It makes sense to me. I also think that 100 being the requirement to stop feeling guilty is sort of silly high. I've never battered a zombie child, but I'm pretty sure I would stop feeling bad about it after like 15 or 20 of them. But that's been debated a million times before. I really thought it was 50 when you stopped getting the debuff, but apparently it's 100. Anyway, rambling aside, making it a catch-all category instead of tracking each monster individually makes a ton of sense to me and should make the game a little less obnoxious, so hooray. Next up today from Kasen Ryu. I struggled with your name the first time I said this, and I'm probably still saying it wrong, so huzzah, sorry about that. Anyway, we've got an audit of things related to thread, fabric, and I really don't know what you call it, whatever the process is by which you would make those things. I guess like fiber twisting, I don't know. Anyway, according to this PR, the author used their wife's expertise in the area to audit these things and hopefully bring them more in bounds with realism. Now, I rarely will cover full audits because there's usually a lot in audit, and because I lack the specific knowledge that usually comes from researching whatever they're changing. I don't even know what to call the main thing here to give you a general idea. I guess probably that you can't turn felt directly into yarn anymore. I've seen people mention that a few times in Discord. I don't think I've ever done it in the game. I never really use yarn in the game, so I'm not even sure why it comes up so regularly. You really don't need to if you don't want to. But anyway, now instead of converting felt directly into yarn, you will instead convert it to wool staples, which you then will turn into yarn. There was also a fabric store added to the game in this PR, which I'm pretty sure exists in real life, even though I've never been to one. My one family member crochets and makes pillows, but their materials come from like a generic craft store, so I've never seen one of these places. However, in the game, we do tend to have a lot of specific shops instead of like catch-all mega stores, so this seems fine to me. So yeah, I'm not 100% on what all to talk about here, but there was a thread/yarn audit and etc., so you might notice some small things changing. Next up today from Fairy Armadillo, we've got Crabapples, changes to Rosehips, and adjusting the spawns of wild fruit trees. So first of all, if you're not familiar, a crabapple is like the runt of the litter, kind of. Hey, so this is a little bit awkward, but when I initially recorded this video, I didn't have a full understanding of what a crabapple is. I think I even tried to define it, but I'm gonna have to edit this section to try and have things make sense. I initially thought that any apple tree below a certain size was regarded as a crabapple tree, but also when I started Googling and doing some research, it looks like there is a specific like crabapple tree where they are these tiny little ornamental fruits that are like very, very small, like a big berry basically. So now I'm a bit confused because I was under the impression that any small apple that, you know, was maybe not fully grown and shriveled and below a certain size was a crabapple. And in fact, if I go to ChatGPT, it says crabapples are not a specific species of apple, but rather the term crabapple refers to any apple tree that produces small sour fruit. And of course it's AI, so you know, take that how you will. So unfortunately, moving forward, I'm just gonna have the initial recording where I didn't have a great definition of what a crabapple is, and hopefully in editing here I can piece this together into something that makes sense, but I might misrepresent these a little bit in this section, sorry about that. A lot of wild apple trees in the United States are not the big, shiny, perfect apples that you would see in a supermarket. They tend to be these very small, tart, little, sort of like sour apples. So anyway, the addition of crabapples actually makes a lot of sense, because the majority of apples that you find in the game are not harvested from like an orchard or a supermarket where you actually get the big, like beautiful apples that everyone is like accustomed to. Instead, we harvest them from wild trees, which more often than not in the United States are crabapple trees. And there's also crabapple pie because, yeah, people make those as well, so why not add that? As for the changes to rose hips, you can no longer pluck them from a rose bush and eat them immediately. Instead, you're going to disassemble them, which converts them to cut rose hips, which are then edible. Now, I do think some people people will be confused by this because cutting them would imply that this is a crafting recipe, but it's fine. I don't think it's a big deal. And then the major part of the PR that I personally like was a nerf to the fruit trees that spawn wildly in the game. Now this doesn't affect orchards or the fruit trees that people plant in their yards, but it is directed at wild spawns. If you go into our forests in summer, you can find a fruit tree basically like every 3 or 4 steps. Now this is not really representative of wild trees in the United States. Now obviously it varies region to region. The United States has a lot of different like biomes, I guess is the word we would use. However, the majority of our wild trees are not like an apple or a peach tree. Most of them are like maples and oaks and, depending where you are, birch trees, things like that. And even when they are fruit-bearing trees, most of the fruit that they grow isn't really good to eat. A lot of wild fruit is like shriveled or not fully grown because the tree doesn't really need to produce a giant beautiful fruit that we would see in a supermarket in order for it to dispense its seeds. Anyway, this PR knocked down those numbers a little bit. It looks like spawns are still quite common. It's not like, you know, you're not going to starve out there or anything like that, but I'm happy to see a reduction in those tree spawns. It makes a lot of sense to me. I was going to say that we could target nut and berries next, but actually where I live at least, nut trees and berry bushes are insanely common. You could easily stumble across a dozen little berry bushes by walking through one little patch of forest. And it's really not the same thing as a large fruit-bearing tree, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, hopefully these sentences all made sense. I had a hard time reading this. Hopefully everything made sense. Hooray for nerfs, I guess. And then finally today from Fairy Armadillo, we've got changes to Survivor masks. Now Survivor equipment has been changed several times. Since I started playing, it's been changed about 1,000,000 times. Even in the last year, we've had people trying to rein in the Survivor recipes to make them make more sense. And I almost never cover these changes because I hate Survivor gear in this game. If you use it, look, that's great, but almost all of them are complete nonsense, even after they've been nerfed 100 times with people trying to fix them. But I can't ignore them forever, I guess, so I'm just gonna read through the bullet points on this PR. So first of all, leather and treated leather are now separate materials because it was decided that regular leather was not really appropriate for a gas mask. Now they appear to be identical except for a tiny bit of acid resistance and breathability being slightly different. Now I'm pretty sure we didn't actually need 2 basically identical items here, especially when literally everything that's not player crafted would presumably already be treated leather, but Fairy Armadillo has done a ton for the game in the last few months, and so I trust them enough to defer to their wisdom here. I'm probably just missing something. Winter Survivor masks have been fully removed from the game because slapping fur on a gas mask doesn't really make any sense at all, and this is another reason why you shouldn't use survival gear in my opinion. Half the time it's just you duct taping extra material to an existing garment and magically it becomes just so much better. And the reasoning for this removal is that people don't do this in real life, and I'm pretty sure someone would have easily figured out putting fur on a gas mask if it actually was viable as a thing to do. So that's been removed. Light survivor masks are now half masks as opposed to the heavy version, which now has a steel faceplate, I guess for ballistic protection, I guess. And then the part that I think is really interesting about this PR is that new survivor masks will now work for people with muzzle mutations. The changes made here, adding a new flag, will benefit tiny mutants as well. Apparently the oversized flag that we've always used for mutation gear only really benefited large creatures and did not properly interact with smaller mutants. I think this is probably the best part of the PR because we do often see like small mutant players talking about these issues, and I think it's really cool that someone finally addressed them, and I think it's cool that you can use a gas mask even if you're wearing a muzzle, or I'm sorry, if you have a muzzle, if you're like a dog mutant or whatever. And then finally here, encumbrance values for many gas masks in the games were made much more uniform since the majority of them should consistently have basically the same penalties. Armored versions do have slightly more encumbrance, but standardizing these values for like the many of them that are pretty identical, that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, apologies for basically just reading this PR to you, but if it wasn't clear, like I said it multiple times, I hate the survivor gear. It's hard for me to muster any interest in them at all for like the 1,000th 7th nerf in a row. But anyway, with that negativity, I think we reached the end of this video. It's kind of amusing. At the start of this script, I wrote something like, oh, this video is actually going to come out on time for once. And as I finish reading this script now, it's quite the opposite. It's Thursday evening, so this is definitely not getting done by tomorrow. And I don't know if you noticed, but I actually am like sick as well. I'm very congested. My throat is very sore. I wanted to record this before I lose my voice, which I think is going to happen tomorrow. So anyway, mission failed. We'll get them next time, and etc. Everyone, thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Of course, I'll be back in the near future with more content, so I'll see you next time.